Hey, it's Angelo Caruso. I want to talk about change during this presentation. I want to tell a story that I'm very fond of. I haven't told this story for a while, but it's a story about rock climbing. Some time ago I went climbing in a place called Joshua Tree National Park. And the reason everybody goes to Joshua Tree if you're a rookie climber, a beginner climber, is because the rocks have a different texture there. They say that the rock there is easier to grip, it's not as slippery, it's more porous. There are a lot of advantages to climbing for the first time in Joshua Tree. It's in California. And when we got there, it was true, the rock was as easy as rock is to climb, but the first experience I had rock climbing was not all that pleasant. Let me tell you what happened. We were climbing in what's called a belay system, and that means that everybody was climbing in a harness, a rope harness. And so the harness fits around the trunk here, and then there's a rope that goes all the way up to the top of the rock face, and it's tied off to what's called a BFR. Now the BFR is a climbing term to describe the type of rock that the rope was tied to. It's a big rock. And so I'm in the harness, the rope goes up to the BFR, and then the rope comes back down. It's like a giant pulley system, and I have a friend down here holding the rope, and I have a friend up there who's watching the process from the top. And I start to climb this 90-foot, 100-foot rock face. Now what I want to tell you about rock climbing, if you've never been climbing before, is it's not easy. It turns out there are muscles in your fingers. And I didn't know I had muscles in my fingers, but they started to hurt after 20 seconds. And the other thing is that as you're climbing, you're trying to find your way, you're trying to find your footing and reach up and pull yourself up, and then you're finding yourself in these little crevasses and you're twisted around, right? And that's not even the hard part, because when you get to the top, the challenge is getting down. More people get hurt climbing down than climbing up a mountain or a rock face. So I get to the top and I'm exhausted, man. I can hardly breathe. I'm panting, I can hardly breathe. And I'm sweating in places I didn't know I could sweat. And I said to my rock climbing friend at the top, Steve, I said, hey Steve, I'm exhausted, man. This has been a lot of fun. I'm just going to take another way down. And he laughed at me and he said, well, what do you think, there's an escalator? You got to go down the same way you came up, pal. And that's when I started to remember that more people get hurt climbing down. And think about this. When you're climbing down, you're trying to put your feet in places you can't see. I mean, that is very, very dangerous. And the reason we're climbing in the belay system, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is because the belay system, what happens is if you're not in a belay system, that if you fall off the rock face, your head will crack like an eggshell, right? This is dangerous. But if you're in the belay system, what happens when you fall is that you will dangle against the side of the rock face until you lose consciousness. So it's safe. So I'm at the top and he says, what do you think, there's an escalator? I mean, you got to go down the same way you came. And I said, I can't. And then I said the two words that no man ever wants to say, especially to another man. I said to him, Steve, I'm afraid. And he said, well, listen, don't be afraid. All you do is just lean back, hold the rope, lean back, and you want to rappel down the face. Kind of like Batman did in the movie. He puts his feet up against the building and he kind of lowers himself, right? That's called the belay system. And here's the thing I want to tell you about change, ladies and gentlemen, that in order to rappel down this rock face, I have to first rock back into space, not knowing what's going to happen. And that's an interesting lesson, especially if you're afraid, because nobody knows what's going to happen during change. And I want to tell you that I did eventually come to grips with my situation. I leaned back into space, holding that rope, and you know what? I put my feet up against the rock face, and I lowered myself all the way to planet Earth. Everything worked out fine. So the interesting thing about change is you have to be willing to not know what's going to happen. More information about change and my programs at michaelangelocaruso.com.